My name is Dave Grossman. I will be your host this morning. This is my trophy wall with which I shamelessly hope to coerce you into trusting me as an authority on the subject matter here. This is, I've been designing and writing and directing story games of various types for about 30 years, starting in the upper left there. This is a laser, I can sort of point. With The Secret of Monkey Island at LucasArts and Day of the Tentacle. Depending on how old you are, it's like maybe kind of an old crowd, you may or may not have grown up with Pajama Sam. And then there's a large section in here that represents my tenure at Telltale Games, may it rest in peace, where I was directing the design and writing there for about a decade. And then down in the lower right-hand corner, you see some stuff you may not have heard of before. It represents my more recent work. They're audio games. 5 years ago, I became one of the founders of Earplay, which is a platform for making stories that you play with your voice. They use voice control and are audio only. We did this first on mobile phones, but then other platforms started to come along. There were voice assistants, Alexa and Google Assistant, and then more recently, Bose made these glasses frames that have some interesting hardware in it, and we expanded to support all of these platforms. And in this talk, I'm going to mostly talk about the voice assistants, but the lessons apply pretty braudly. We've done quite a few of these things now, actually a lot more than this. The engine handles all kinds of stuff, but they are mostly kind of branchy choice-based things in the sort of a Telltale Games model. And there are some specific reasons why we like to do it that way I'll get to in a minute. They tend to be kind of big compared to other skills that tell you the weather or whatever, that just you kind of in and out. Ours you may play for an hour or 2 hours, 3 hours, some of them. It's still, though, not uncommon for them to be designed and written and sometimes implemented by a single person. And so I want to give you a window into what that process looks like from the ground up. Let's talk about what we normally do, how we normally do it, and then what happens when we break our own rules. So this will be a kind of a rambling, cautionary / inspirational tale, and hopefully it will have some useful nuggets in it for you. I'm going to talk about the technology a little bit. I'm going to get into language models quite a lot. I'm going to talk about user experience design and touch a little bit on the writing, some tips there for doing stuff. These are kind of the things I think of as the core of narrative design, and I think of a narrative designer as being probably the most appropriate person to do this by themselves if they were going to do that. So just show of hands, who in the audience self-identifies as a narrative designer in some way or wants to be? Good, you're the right crowd then. And how many have actually tried to do this, tried to make a voice skill or a voice app or anything? Not many, okay. But some, so that's good. Good on you for giving it a shot. So, it occurred to me last week that this talk is kind of a travelogue. So let's learn about the country that we'll be visiting, which is the country of voice. It has some peculiar characteristics that other countries don't have. For one thing, your input to one of these stories is intermittent. The story is not listening to the player all the time. It can't, it's not allowed to for legal reasons, privacy reasons. You as the developer are not permitted to just open up the microphone and listen all the time. So turn taking has to happen. And it's super important for the audience to know when it is their turn to talk. So for that, we use very explicit prompts. And you could use a sound effect or a bell or something like that, but we like to stay in fantasy with everything if we can. So the way we do it is we just have a character ask the player a direct question at some point in the story, and then you, the player, are expected to answer that question. That's how we let you know, okay, it's your turn. There's a writing corollary to that, which is that is the only time that anybody asks anybody a direct question in one of our stories. And having to write a whole couple of hours worth of audio in which the characters do not ask each other direct questions and never speak in rhetorical questions strikes writers as strange and uncomfortable at first. It's not, though, as hard as it sounds. You get used to it. Second characteristic is you must make your decisions quickly in these stories. Alexa, for example, gives you 10 seconds to talk, and then it'll shut the microphone off if you haven't started saying something. It'll repeat the question one time, and then it'll shut the skill down entirely. So you have to kind of be able to make that decision quickly. This is mostly also about not leaving the microphone open for privacy reasons. So for that, we just make sure that when it is your turn to make a decision, your options there are clear, simple, and they are few in number, and we enumerate them for you right then and there. And so that dictates the nature of how you would write that prompt. It's sort of a quick summation of your options at that point in the story. Thing 3, voice recognition is really cool, but it is not magic, amazingly. It's technology. So with someone who is mumbling or turning away from the microphone or maybe standing in a kitchen where dinner is actively being prepared, the sound can get kind of muddy. And if you give the voice recognition muddy sound, it has a much harder time doing its job. It's easy for it to get confused. So we try to make it easier on the voice recognition itself by making its decisions easier, and we make the things that it is listening for also clearly distinct and few in number. So we offer the player clear options, but we also offer them specific ways to say what they want. And we carefully manage those phrases, again, part of the writing of these things, so that they do not sound similar to one another. And all of that makes it easier for the voice recognition to do its job under difficult circumstances, which difficult circumstances are more common than you might think. And these prompts tend to get a little awkward, and they sound stilted and they stick out, but actually that's good because it makes them work better as prompts. You sort of sit up and take notice because somebody's talking funny at you, and you go, oh, it must be my turn again. So we will actually often go so far as to capitalize while we're writing the key phrases in the prompt to get the voice actors to hit them harder and sound even more stilted and authoritative, so that then you're sort of reminded, hey, it must be my turn. Realism is not our primary concern here. It's functionality. So putting all that together, we wind up with this model where the stories are turn-based and they're structured so that we can focus all your options on a single moment at any time, and then those moments are embodied in these prompt questions of 2 or 3 distinct actions that sound quite different from one another. That's the usual model. And these are good rules. However, if we followed them all the time, this talk would be less fun. So last year, Amazon Studios got in touch, and they asked us if we wanted to do a story on Alexa, an exclusive, next to this new show that they were making, this Jack Ryan show, which sounded kind of cool. So we said, all right, we're in. We live for that stuff. So we delved a little deeper with them, and the inspiration for what they wanted to do was this escape room that they had also commissioned as a promotional effort for the show, and they had they built it and they ran some teams of influencers through it, and they did a Twitch stream of that, and it was, I watched it, it was pretty fun. Everybody had a good time. And one of the peculiar aspects of this escape room was that Alexa was built into it. There was a device in every room, and it sort of became part of the puzzle and so on. And their idea was they just had such a good time with the escape room, they wanted to bring that feeling to a Jack Ryan story on Alexa that you could then experience in your own home. So what that meant was we were doing an adaptation of something that was already a kind of a loose adaptation of a TV show that we hadn't seen and we hadn't read. That's okay. That's just what the job's like. More on difficulties getting to see the show a little later in the talk. But for now, we wanted to make this story feel like an escape room, and central to that feeling is this idea of exploration. You want to sort of poke around and open things up and find clues and put them together in a very sort of self-directed and free-form kind of a way. And so one of the first decisions that we made was we would take our usual wisdom of this connected structure of discrete moments and throw it out the window. So instead, you'd be constrained only by what chapter you were in or what location you were in. And instead of asking those very pointed questions, the nice prompts of, here are your 3 options, we would ask the much more general question, okay, what do you want to do next? Tell us anything. So we were already getting ourselves into trouble, we knew at this point. And the problem was something that we were already aware of from the days when adventure games allowed you to type in your input at the keyboard using the English language. And the problem is that there's a huge difference between what you can express with your input mechanism, in both cases here, the English language, capable of expressing just about any thought you can have, and the stuff that's actually addressable by the game, which is some tiny subset of that because the game is made by human beings and in a finite amount of time. You just can't cover all that space. So all this blue space here in the middle is frustration. The audience gets really frustrated with this stuff because we're not just allowing them, we're actually encouraging them to try things that are doomed to failure, which is not a very friendly thing to do for your audience. Notice this is a problem with voice control in general. This sort of unfettered freedom of speech is a fourth characteristic of the medium. That, by the way, is the Constitution of the United States, freedom of speech. Get it? So we've been avoiding this problem up till now because we've been using these clear options with specific phrasing, and that clarifies the addressable space moment by moment for the player. It's one of the reasons why we do it. So we realized that open structure or no, we still needed to clarify a useful range of actions for the player. And these are the ones we picked. They're basically what you would find in an adventure game of the sort of point and click variety. And they're solving the same problem that they do in those old adventure games. So the idea was, at any time, a player would be able to do any one of these 9 things, and there would be a list of about 50 targets in the game, people and objects and stuff, that you would be able to do these things to. So the ramifications of that bring us to the next step in our awesome travel paradigm. Let's talk about language for a second. So how many in the room know when I'm talking about voice recognition, what I mean by the phrase language model? Anybody encountered that? Okay, not too many, so we'll explain. So this is actually kind of a big focus of the talk because it's totally unique to voice recognition medium. And even if you aren't the one putting it together, it will affect your life. It affects everyone's life. So the idea is there is this voodoo black box that exists between the player and the story. And when you're playing one of these things, you say something, and then that thing that you have said gets digitized into a waveform, and it gets sent off over the internet to Amazon or Google or whoever it is that's doing your voice recognition. And then what you get back from that is 2 things. You get an utterance, which is its best guess at the actual words that got said. And then you get what's called an intent, which is the important thing for you. It's a tokenized meaning. So it's and you help define this. It's basically in the space that you need it to be in for your particular skill. And you need it distilled down like this to make your life possible. You don't want to be messing around with processing the natural language. That's an AI hard problem. Leave it to the professionals. Don't try and do it. But you do have to help this black box out a little bit because it's not magic, it's technology. And what you do is you provide it some sample phrases, and you group them into intents and label them according to what your own intent names. Sort of a rough guide for the black box for how it's going to interpret meaning in your story. So this example is all about just wanting to know what the temperature is outside. I've given it some phrases here that address different things. There's one that doesn't mention the hot or cold at all. It's just about wearing a coat. Notice that I will get now into a little parser problem of my own here. There's no way I'm going to be able to enumerate every possible way in the English language that you can say something that indicates an interest in what the temperature is outside. Fortunately, Alexa, when you send this off to build the language model, will happily expand on the examples. That's good. It does it invisibly, which is less good, so you sort of don't know what's going on there. The good news is it will recognize things that you didn't think of, which is great. The bad news is it will recognize things that you didn't think of, and so you'll get some false positives in there, which is another reason why we try to be very specific about what our users should say. So coming back to this Jack Ryan thing now, we've got these 9 actions and about 50 objects. You multiply those together, it's about 450 intents. We tend to have a lot of intents in our skills, maybe 100 or so, but this is already on the way to crazy town. Fortunately, there is a feature that's supported by a lot of these things that you can use to ameliorate that. Amazon calls it slots, we call it entities internally. The basic idea is that it's going to allow the machines to do more of the heavy lifting around all of those intents in that 9 times 50. So the way it works is instead of having a separate intent for examining the drawer and examining the cabinet, examining the padlock, and specifying those all individually, you just have one way of saying, okay, I want to examine a thing. So that utterance, that thing will have examine the object, look at the object, and different ways that you might phrase that. but you leave a placeholder in for the object, and then elsewhere, you define that list of what can go in there, and that's your 50 objects, and each of those can have its own little set of utterances that define it. And then the computer does all the hard work of meshing those together. And then when you use it, what you get back is both the name of the intent, I want to examine something, and also the target of that intent, I want to examine the desk. So that takes your 9 times 50 and makes it into 9 plus 50, which is much more manageable. Now, we hadn't used this much, so I built a little test case prototype out of the first scene, and I threw some inputs at it that were designed to be as confusing as possible. I had some utterances in there that differed only by one syllable and meant different things. I swapped words around, intended for it to still recognize that. I used switch as both a verb and an object. It did really well. None of that stuff confused it, actually. I was very impressed. Context helps it to get the right idea from these things. So eventually we would get into trouble with some of the built-in slot types that they have, but that's later in the talk. For now, I'll just give the general advice that whether or not you're expecting that language model to be problematic, you should test it as early as you can because it will come up. And again, don't forget about real-world situations. If your office is like a nice, quiet place, try confusing the thing some way. Challenge it. So now that I've got my technical proof of concept, I started thinking about breaking down the actual story. In our amazing travelogue paradigm, I'm going to call it itinerary. Now, the source material, it's an escape room. It's more premise than story. And the idea was you were CIA agents, and you were in the safe house run by the CIA, and for some reason it had these echo devices all over it. You started in a small room, and then you broke your way into a big room for reasons that were not clear. Then your handler calls you on the phone and says, you got to find this MacGuffin that looks like this. So you solve some crazy puzzles. And then you find the MacGuffin, and then your handler immediately tells you, you got to find another one. So you solve some more puzzles. And then a cool thing happens. Your handler, Foxtrot is her name, shows up in person, and she takes the things from you that you found, and then she kidnaps one of the people on the team and takes him away. That's cool. Then everybody gets thrown into a death trap, and then they escape, and then that's pretty much it. There's no ending to this story. You don't find out what happens to your handler or the stuff she's stolen or anything. And also, typical of escape rooms, there's a lot of ludonarrative dissonance in this thing. There are a lot of puzzles that are built using thematically appropriate elements, but which, once you get them into puzzles and think about them, they don't really make much sense in terms of either story or character. This bothers us. We're a story studio. We want to do a little more than that. So most of that stuff got thrown out. In an adaptation, you want to keep whatever works and is strong. For us, this betrayal thing was the coolest bit. So we made that the middle of the story, and now it has some build-up and some consequences. We've decided we would have the team dynamic rise and fall a little bit, and there was a test of the kind of cohesiveness of the team after that moment of betrayal. After you discover that there is a mole on your team, there's some sort of infighting, and you're asked to take sides in it, and it's all good stuff. And then way down at the end, we added you get to try and catch the bad guy, which seemed important somehow. Notice that most of this is now about the team and the people in the team. It's always a good thing for a story, is to have people in the middle of it. Back to this idea of itinerary for a second. On a trip, you want to go to some different places at your destination. You have different things to see and different things to eat. You go to Spain, you go to Barcelona, and you go to Granada, and they're very different from each other, and that's good. You want some variety. Similarly, in your story, you want a little variety in tone and in tension. So when I get to the next step, which always for me is to do a broad outline of the whole thing, 10,000 feet, just looking down, I decided this time to give each chapter an inspirational tag, just one word about what it should feel like to be in that chapter, as a guide for making the pieces different in terms of what was the player activity in there and where the tension comes from. Escape rooms typically use the giant timer on the wall, ticking down an hour, as their main tension generator. We kept being pressured on this project to include them literally. People were like, well, okay, this sounds great, but where's the timer? We thought we could do a little better than just having a number. Stories are good at tension, and so are games. So let me get a little bit into the kind of breakdown of the different chapters. The first one had to be both the hook and the tutorial for the experience. So it needed to be simple, and it needed to be short, and it needed to be fast-paced, and it needed to be exciting. So we decided to chuck the timer in that scene and replace it with something you can't really use in an actual physical escape room, which is a death trap. We had a room that was filling up with water and a character who was in that water, giving you very frequent updates on how she was about to drown. And you were basically talking to her on the phone and trying to talk her through a puzzle that was going to get her out. And so the water is getting higher and higher, and time is running out. You can actually fail this scene, and she will pretend to drown. We want you to worry about the threats that we're making and take them seriously, both as a player and as a person invested in the story. So it's common for us to put something in at the beginning that you can fail and kind of have to start over before you've invested too much time. We refrain from actual death in this scene. It's a little too early, narratively speaking, to be killing somebody off. So this is actually, it's a training exercise, and they're all kind of just pretending to do their parts, but you can fail it, and you have to start over and do the scene over again until you get it right. We also, at this point, introduced the idea of this bad guy, Kessel, who was the architect of the original version of that trap that you're essentially training on. He's a terrorist guy who, not the guns and bombs authority, but he's the guy who moves money around for all the other terrorists. He's smart guy, likes to challenge himself against you, the allegedly intelligent CIA agents, by trying to catch you in traps. And also, he's the kind of person who, when he leaves his Wi-Fi password around on a post-it, he'll do it in code in some way that only he makes sense to him, and that you will have to sort of puzzle out. This obviously is just a way to ground all of the crazy escape room kinds of things you're going to do in the story. We wanted them to at least have an excuse for why they were there, and so most of the story takes place essentially at his house, which is a crazy place. His name, by the way, was very poorly chosen. That'll come later. I'll explain why. So in the second chapter, you and your team get together and you go to Berlin. You go to his headquarters. He has several, but this one has just been discovered by your compatriots. And you're there. You're doing exploration and puzzle solving. This is the part of the story that feels the most like an escape room. There's codes and things like that. You're discovering the secrets of the place. The difference between this, I think, and a regular escape room is that you're more of a safecracker, and it's all about breaking into things rather than breaking out of anything. You're trying to get in, unearth secrets. It didn't make much sense to put a timer on this scene at all, so instead what we did was we put some traps, booby traps in the room, and sort of made a lot of noise about those, and we set one off pretty early in the scene so that you would take that seriously. And then they find out that there's a mole on the team, and get worried about that, and they start sniping at each other. And also, at that point, you find another small room, which is where these people keep all their records. And so the player activity changes here. It becomes more informational. You're looking through files and finding stuff in photographs and combining things, listening to audio recordings, all gathering evidence with this idea that you're going to find out who the mole is. And it becomes increasingly likely that it's somebody on your direct team. You find evidence pointing to both of the people who are physically with you in the room, and they start getting upset with each other about this, and they ask you to take sides, and that's where most of the tension comes from in this scene. Again, there's no timer on that scene. Then Foxtrot, the handler, who has been off-site until now, shows up and betrays everybody and knocks them all out. And then you wake up and you're in an actual death trap, and it has an actual timer finally, but we've attached it to a bomb just to add a little extra oomph. Again, something you probably don't want to do in a real escape room, but we're not in a real escape room. And what the player does in this scene is a little bit adventure gamey. You put together a thumbprint kit out of stuff that you find in the room. You go around, you're just trying to find the right thumbprint that'll let you unlock this phone that's going to let you stop this bomb before it blows you up. Also, one of the team members is missing now, and you're not sure if he's in league with the mole or what. You don't know why he's gone. You don't think about that too much right away because there's a bomb ticking down. But as soon as you deactivate that bomb, you get into the next room and you find him. And now he's been locked into one of these water traps. And it hasn't. You recognize it immediately from having trained on it at the beginning of the piece. And it hasn't been triggered yet, and you know how it gets triggered if if you turn off the lights. So it would be possible to leave him behind. And there are various practical and emotional reasons to do that. For one, you're still not really sure if he's on your side or not. But also, practically speaking, Foxtrot is now getting away with the things that you spent time finding. And you have to make a call as to whether you want to spend the time to try and get him out of there and take him with you. And it's kind of either way, it makes sense. The trap turns out to have some twists so that your original solutions don't quite work. Makes it sort of a trap revisited. And both of these things also, they have time limits on them, so you can fail them. If you fail the bomb, again, no one is killed by that, but it does destroy all of the evidence that you were hoping to take home, so you'll take it on the chin from your supervisor if you let it go off. And if you let the water trap fill up all the way, then the guy in it does die, and you will also take it on the chin from your supervisor for that. Doesn't like it when you fail stuff. Then the final chapter is more of a chase, and Foxtrot is getting away on an airplane, and you find her car, and you're just kind of sifting through it. The puzzles are informational again, but on a timer this time, and you're just trying to find out like where she's going, what flight she's going to be on, what name she's going to be traveling under, so that you can locate her and stop her. And since there is a limited amount of time before the flight takes off, you can fail this scene too. It doesn't ruin everything, but it does mean that you don't catch her, and this guy gives you a hard time about it. He does your performance review at the end. I think there's about 9 or 10 different ones that you can get, depending on what you have screwed up and what you haven't. So this is a guy from the show. It's James Greer. He's the director of the whole TFAD operation. Speaking of the show, by the way, we haven't seen it yet by this point in the process. We've gone pretty far. Stay tuned. So next step after that outline, we always do is a detailed design, and the idea there is we're going to break it down into what all of the individual interactions are going to be in the whole piece. And that's normally for us is about engineering a lot of these moments of discrete choice. For this project, we're talking about sort of what are the objects in the chapter, what happens with you when you interact with them, how does that drive the drama and the story, and how does it resolve. It's basically adventure game design, which I fortunately know a lot about. I usually work out the dynamics using traditional methods. And adventure game design is kind of a different talk entirely, one which I would need another hour or 3 to cover. So I can't really do it justice here. So instead, let's talk about what happens when you do adventure game design on an audio platform. There's one thing in particular that comes up here that doesn't come up elsewhere. It has to do with memory. Now, normally, in a game when you need to interact with a whole bunch of stuff, you have a handy persistent visual like this to remind you of what all that stuff is. It's just there's a lot of things to remember. But on an audio platform, you got nothing. And we run very quickly up against the limits of human short-term memory. And don't take my word for it, let's try it. So imagine you're playing my game now, and you're standing outside the lair of a known terrorist, and you speak a code phrase to get in, and the door opens. You go in, and one of the guys on your team starts describing the room to you, and he says, "Oh, there's a desk here. It's kind of a cool-looking old antique one. I think probably bought at auction. There's some rusty old lockers, kind of very industrial, bolted to the wall over there. They don't really match anything in here. There's a nice-looking map on the wall. It's framed, and the frame has hinges. That's very interesting. Right next to that, there's a cheap poster. It's a periodic table of the elements. There's also an old CRT monitor. It's got to be 15 years old at least. And on the floor, there's a rug, which is maybe the most garish thing you've ever seen in your life. It's all primary colors, clashes with everything. Well, let's start at the beginning. You say, let's look at that desk. Okay, well, it looks like somebody's been doing some work here. He's got a notebook, and it's open, and there's a paperweight that's holding it open, a little glass one, kind of nice. There's a bottle of something he may have been drinking here, and also the desk has a drawer, and that drawer is currently closed. Oh, well, we can't have that. You say, let's open the drawer. I want to see everything. So the drawer is stuck. There doesn't appear to be a lock on it of any sort. It may just be stuck. And one of your team members is carrying a knife, and she offers to jimmy that drawer open for you. Yes, please do that, you say, and then a booby trap goes off, kaboom, and she's injured, and there's a little sequence where you have to kind of patch her back up again. At the end of that sequence, she's like, all right, I'm ready for action. What next? Now, possibly you do have a very concrete idea of what you want to do next. But likely you have also forgotten at least half and possibly 3/4 of the objects that have been mentioned so far. And that problem only gets worse as you go further into this game, which I said is going to take more than an hour to complete. Now, normally we don't have this problem because we've been orchestrating the context so that you don't have to remember more than 3 things ever. But because this is a broad and exploratory experience, we have to take measures to aid the memory. Our case here is kind of extreme, but the lesson still applies pretty much everywhere. Memory is a problem in an audio medium because you just don't have those persistent visuals reminding you of anything at all. So as a general writing note, you should be repeating the important information more often than you think you should. Again, make it sound a little bit stilted if you have to, because realism is not the goal here. It's sort of game functionality. In our case, we could implement a simple list of available objects on demand, and we did do that. However, it's a little bit unsatisfying. The list gets long, and it's hard to process while you're listening to it if there are 12 or 13 things. And it takes you right out of the fantasy to have somebody just listing off the objects in the room. So one of the better and more effective things that we did was to contextualize that information. We wrote a bunch of status reports. That was just a thing that you could ask a character for. Give me a status report. And instead of just listing everything for you, here's all of the context that you have encountered so far, it would sort of take that into account. What have you finished with? What have you not started? And what maybe have you been working on recently? And so it would focus on only the things that would be interesting to you right at this moment. And this is part of how we're directing the experience that no one can see, is by kind of focusing the player attention with these things. You can also do a lot of redirection with the responses to other player actions. It's kind of like doing hints. When you do hints in an adventure game, you sort of, if someone interacts with an object and they do the wrong thing, you sort of hint them towards doing the right thing. And if they do the right thing, then you sort of hint them to what's the next interesting thing. All that stuff can be used to hint at drama as well and kind of direct the story experience. These status reports are doubly useful. Remember that we had this constraint of limited time. You had to answer quickly or the skill was going to drop. Well, it turns out when you're solving puzzles of the escape room variety, this is sort of inevitable that you're going to have to stop paying attention to the skill for a while and write something down on a piece of paper. And either you will pause it or it will drop of its own accord. But either way, you're going to have to start it up again. And so we needed a way when someone was starting the story back up again, whether it had been 1 minute or 5 minutes, or they had gone to work and dinner and come back after 12 hours, a good way to just sort of jump them back into the story and sort of remind them what they needed to be thinking about. And these status reports were perfect for that. So anytime you did start the skill from nothing, if you had a bookmark in the middle of the story, we would throw one of these at you. Super good. So now ordinarily, after I get that detailed design all done, what I like to do is start the implementation and create a skeleton upon which I can then write all the dialogue. I leave the dialogue writing until the very last if I can. However, I don't always get to do that. And in this case, we had a script approval in the contract, and our partners needed a fair amount of time to get that turned around. There's a whole chain of custody that goes from you to the producer. It takes a while to get to the actual filmmakers or TV people to read it. So the script got written on paper first. This probably happens, I'd say, about half the time we wind up having to do this, just the productions being what they are. The script, incidentally, is about 160 pages, including a bunch of pseudocode in it to explain how the different pieces fit together, because it's not entirely clear because this is a non-linear sort of a thing. Also, incidentally, right there at the end of the script writing process is when I finally got to read some of the scripts from the show and actually see the show. Time for a little sidebar about studio security in Hollywood, which is fun and interesting. I want to preface this part by saying that our partners have been fantastic about this stuff. They've always been really helpful and pleasant. I've had good experiences with them. This project was no exception. Amazon Studios was really good to us, and I would work with them again in a minute. What you run up against, though, are processes that are not designed for you. The processes for working with anyone outside of the studio are mostly for people who are doing things like making action figures and lunchboxes. And those people don't need the kind of access or feedback or level of detail that you do when you're trying to write a complementary piece of fiction. On top of that, everybody is super worried about leaks, and you cannot blame them for that. If there's recent history has borne out a few things, and if your show winds up on the internet before it winds up on your own streaming service, that's really bad. So consequently, as a partner, even one under non-disclosure, it can be pretty hard to get hold of a script. Now, this Jack Ryan project was actually pretty smooth. They were willing to let me have stuff, but what they didn't trust was the internet and the mail. So they weren't going to send me anything remotely. I had to go and meet with an actual person, and she would screen the show for me, and then she actually handed me a pile of scripts at that time that I could take home and use as reference. The reason that it took this long is that we were all really busy, and our offices were 400 miles apart. I'm not in LA. So it just took a little while to get things going. I've definitely had worse. In fact, let me explain about one time when I had worse. One time I had to fly to Los Angeles, and they took me up to a weirdly deserted floor at the top of a tall building, and somebody brought me the script, and he took the little pin out of the script so that I could move pages individually, and he brought me a notepad for taking notes on and a special red pen for taking notes with. And then I sat there with the script for a couple of hours, and then they came and they took everything away, and they scanned my notes. They did not just hand me a thumb drive or anything. No, I had to fly back home, and then they sent me the notes a few days later inside of a secure app that I had to put on my laptop, and I had to go through a vetting process to get a login for that app. And the notes, of course, couldn't be exported from that app in any way. You had to view them only in the app. They were encoded. And then there was a second app that I had to install on my phone to do a numerical two-factor authentication every time I entered the password, which was about every 10 minutes unless I kept tapping the window, which of course I didn't because I was trying to work and I just wanted to have the notes up there on the screen next to me. So it was like having the notes inside of a safe when the door kept closing on me. That project turned out fine too. It's just a little bit inconvenient. I just want to let you know what you might run up against. Anyway, 160 pages of script later, we got it sent off for approvals, and now I think I can finally do the implementation. Yay! I like that part. Some people do use code for this. We have a tool that lets you draw little boxes and put stuff in it and connect them to create the structure. This isn't it, by the way. This is a Visio drawing. I was asked not to show an actual screenshot of our tool, some kind of a trade secret or something, so I took that out. But basically, it looks kind of like this, and it lets you make little boxes that have the dialogue for each piece, and your audio is going to get plopped on there. And then there are different kinds of transitions that connect them. Some of them are direct, and some of them are like you're checking conditionally some things that may have been done previously in the skill, or you can check the date even, or something like that, and just go to one of a different set of destinations based on that. And then sometimes you can make it stop and listen for some input from the player, and go to different places based on that. So it's good to get a working version up as soon as you can. Like I said, I like to do it even before I write the dialogue if possible. And the reason for that is you want to test this stuff. You want to get it in front of some people who you don't know and who don't know your skill and who don't know what it's supposed to be. And that way you can test all your assumptions and fix some problems. The more complicated your piece is, the more important this is. You start with text-to-speech voice, or you can even do, sometimes we'll do a scratch version, just me sitting at the desk, like speaking into a microphone, before you spend the money to record actual actors, because that is by far the most expensive thing that you will do in the whole process. You want to fix stuff before then. So speaking of fixing problems, let's talk about some stuff that came up, because it's fun to hear about other people's misfortunes, isn't it? This is the first full test of the language model, and there's always some things that come up with that. We try to be careful with the writing, but it's sort of not possible to avoid everything. Things like door and drawer, like we've got two objects in our list that sound very much like each other, easy to confuse. This tends to work out, though, okay, because the door and the drawer are in different parts of the story. There aren't any times when both of them are both available and interesting. So we can combine them, essentially, and assume that the player is referring to whichever one of them matters right now. There's two ways to do that. We can either do it on that structure that I just showed you, and we have an input for door and an input for drawer, and they both point to the same thing. Or you can literally combine them as part of the language model, just make them synonyms of each other, and you'll just get one token back that's door drawer or something like that. We had a few other things like that in the skill. Note in the notebook, the table and the periodic table, confusable under some circumstances. Again, they were in completely different chapters, so we just combined them. We did have to change a padlock code. We learned by experience that 8 is perhaps the hardest number to detect of all of the numbers. It's a really, there's not much there with an 8. It's 8, 8. It's just like this short guttural bark. It's like a tiny, tiny amount of sound. So it's hard to compare that to anything else that might be a tiny, tiny amount of sound. So we changed it to 7, and this was a puzzle that was actually based on that periodic table. So we were actually exchanging oxygen for nitrogen, which upon research didn't make no sense at all. It was fine. Okay, remember this guy? I said his name was a bad choice. Anybody want to guess why, given what we've been talking about? Yeah. So there's a built-in required intent on Alexa, which by convention ends the skill if there isn't anything hanging around to be canceled, which there never is in our story. And it's what we call a universal intent, which means it's valid at any point in the skill. So we can't do what we did with the door and the drawer and make some kind of positional decision about which one of those it is. It's just going to get confused, and it's going to send a cancel intent, and we're required at that point to shut the skill down. So this guy has, thank goodness we tested that before we went and recorded anybody expensive saying his name. He has a completely different name in the skill now. Never name anyone Alexa either, in case you're wondering. Not that we did that, but yeah. There are some other built-in intents. Stop is one of them, and that obviously does stop the skill. We already knew never to include stop as a player choice. It's just one of those things you avoid. It comes up a lot, actually, in a story. You want to stopping something to be one of your options, and we just avoid that if we can. The list of phrases that are listened for these built-in intents is not public. You don't know what's in it, but I can tell you now from personal experience that one of the synonyms for stop is that, turn off. So unfortunately, we had more than one puzzle that revolved around turning something off, so we couldn't really engineer that out of the story at this point. Fortunately, we got lucky. It doesn't really cause trouble too often, because if there's context for it, if you're turning off something, the language model is smart enough to pick up on that, and it'll send us a turn off the thing intent instead of the turn off the skill intent, and we don't stop. Where the trouble happens is if somebody is mumbling or turning away from the microphone at exactly the wrong moment, that can take part of the speech and make it sound muddy enough to be misinterpreted as background noise, and then you lose it and you just get the turn off, and then it does ask you to turn the skill off, and you have to do it, or you will not pass certification. Exit is another built-in thing. This is like a hard reset. You can't even be nice about it. With a stop, we get to send a little message that says, thanks for playing. With exit, it just cuts it off instantly. Exit also has some hidden synonyms, among which we discovered was close. Now, what are the odds? Out of 9 actions, we'd pick 2 that are hidden synonyms for please stop the skill now. And it was, here again, because the players are providing some context about what to close, it usually doesn't get confused. But had I known in advance about turn off and close, I would have tried to just design the thing around them. And I would advise you to do that too. One more thing about the language model. I'm certainly talking about the language model a lot, aren't I? Amazon has some great pre-made slop types for recognizing things like numbers and the names of cities and the names of countries, things where there are a lot of elements and potentially a lot of ways to say them. If you think about the numbers, 1017 isn't the only way you say that. You might say 1017, you might say 1017, especially if you're entering a code on a keypad, and every number has that same problem. So rather than actually build that thing yourself and list out all of those potential ways to say those things, it's good to have something provided by Amazon that you can just use. And I got excited about the possibilities of these because they're all kind of good for code-based sort of puzzles. And I used 4 or 5 of them in the skill. Well, one day we discovered that no had stopped working for some reason. You couldn't answer no to any question in the skill, including are you sure you want to start over? Which is a good thing to be able to answer no to. Some investigation revealed that no was actually, the word was getting returned correctly, but it was being flagged as a country. Go figure. Country is a big intent. There's a lot in it, and so it would capture a lot of extraneous things that weren't listed somewhere else in the model. So if the player just said banana for some reason, it would say, well, that sounds like a little like some of the countries in my model, so I'm gonna flag that as a country. It tries to put something into one of your boxes as much as it can. So that was one of the bigger boxes that we had, so a lot of stuff went into it. This was the only time, though, that something that was literally specified as part of another intent got trapped by that somehow, and we cannot explain this. We have no idea why that happened. We don't know what's in the built-in intents. That's not public information, and again, we don't really know what the language model does with the data that we give it up front. It's voodoo. It does not explain itself, and that's why you need to test it, and then test it some more. As it turns out, there are not so many countries, so we just took that built-in intent out and made our own, and everything was fine. Now here's probably our biggest problem. It has nothing to do with the language model, it's all us. Once we got this thing in front of real people, we realized we had not been nearly clear enough about this list of actions and the fact that that was all the useful things you could do, and people were being plagued by the parser problem, which I mentioned earlier. They were trying to do all kinds of stuff. They were trying to chisel things and climb things and make a rope with their clothes, and they were getting frustrated, and they were quitting the skill and sending back bad reviews from the test bed. Fortunately, this was not live players, this was test players. So in retrospect, our tutorial was not at all well designed in this one respect of establishing that addressable space for the player. So we added some extra guidance from Alexa here, put some more comments from her in there, including a lengthy monologue that comes up front before the story even starts that really just hits you over the head with like, I'm going to give you this list of things, and that's what's useful and nothing else, so stick with that. The advice here is just be as heavy-handed as you can about describing that addressable space. It's not possible to overdo that, and it's super important to get that in the player's mind. We also, we discovered, as we always do, I shouldn't point my head directly at this mic, I don't think. We discovered, as we always do, that a couple of the puzzles were too hard. We just expect that. We just don't know which ones it's going to be, honestly, until we get it in front of people. And mostly what we do for that is we just wrote more hints. The hints in this game were in fantasy. You would just call headquarters, and they would sort of contextually try and give you some advice on whatever you seem to be working on. So they're actually kind of fun to hear. Now, eventually, you have to stop fixing stuff because your recording date comes up on the calendar. It's some minimal number of days before the date you actually have to ship. You've pushed it as late as possible. You've pushed it a couple of days past that, but eventually it comes up. So you got to do it. And you may not be doing recording. You may be making a skill where you want to do everything with text-to-speech. And you can do that. Some people do that, and it's cheaper and it's easier. And you can fix stuff right up to the last minute without getting anybody in the studio. But we feel that good drama and good story need good actors. It's just kind of a philosophy of ours. So that's Kat Cressida, who is a good actor, plays Tango in the story. Now, audio production is kind of a known quantity that you should be on another track to really hear about, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But we'll say this about the writing for it. This is a non-linear kind of experience. Like I said, it's broad and exploratory, and you're recording these chapters full of audio for things. And so you need to be aware of the potential differences in tension and tone between the different lines, because they may be playing next to each other really crazily out of order. So it's good to think about that a lot, kind of compress everything into a smaller range of tone and tension within a scene and just kind of go for an overall tone and annotate them like crazy. Like this is tension level 2, and this is tension level 4, and this is tension level 6. So that way you can have, like for example, in the scene where the water is filling up the room, a real rise in what you're getting back from the character who's in that trap about how dire things are, and yet still have it mesh with the responses to your puzzle actions that may be interleaved in there anywhere. Some other stuff you might want to know about as a writer. On Alexa specifically, you have a time limit between your player interactions. You're allowed 4 minutes of audio in between. Now, 4 minutes is a long time. I'm going to tell you, that is an eternity. Writers in the room, you really have to keep the pace up for interactive audio. If you go much over a minute between the player actions in one of these things, it's even more important than something where you have a visual. If you go more than a minute, that better be a deliberately slow scene. And if you ever get to 4 minutes, I'm coming over to your house and smack you on the head, because it means you've forgotten that the player is the most important character in your piece. Just ignored them. One of the limitations specific to Alexa is you only get 5 audio files. So if you're doing something complicated and you thought, okay, I'm going to be clever, and this character who may or may not be in this scene, I'm just going to record their lines separately and have them in separate files and drop them in the places where they would go, well, you're going to get to 5 different files pretty quickly, and then it's just not going to work after that. It's very restricted if you're doing anything complex. Also, gapless playback is not guaranteed on most of these platforms, and so again, if you've got something sort of going on in the background, your scene is in a diner and you want noise in there, plates clinking and stuff like that, you won't want to hear like these weird silences in the middle of that. So what you're going to wind up having to do is, instead of piecing it out and playing several different files back to back, you have to make one big one, and you have to make a whole bunch of different versions of it to take care of what are all the conditions that might be possible going into this particular moment. I try to limit that to 32 versions just to keep myself sane and to keep my sound designer from coming to my house and doing mean things to me. Okay, pretty good. Now that your audio is done, you kind of plop it into the structure, and then you're kind of ready to go once that piece is done. There's one last little formality you have to go through. There's a certification process. Amazon's got to sign off before you can go live. It's like going through customs. And a lot of the things that they will flag for you are functional things. The engineers will worry about those. But there are also some content policy guidelines that you should just be aware of. Sex and violence that's a typical thing. I mean, every platform has that, right? Don't they? Violence, by the way, includes unsettling content, unquote. There was a demo that we made for a ghost story a couple of years ago that we think was perhaps the first skill to be rejected on that basis. It was just a little bit too graphically grisly and descriptive. The ghost story was fine. It was just the demo that they wouldn't let on there. So watch out. You're not allowed to run ads, and you're not allowed to recommend other people's skills. That just means Amazon doesn't want you getting in the way of their space of being a store. You're not allowed to be a store. They do that. Which is reasonable of them. Hate speech is explicitly prohibited. I was Twitter, please take notice. I was glad to see that in there. There are lots more, maybe just look them up before you do anything questionable. Now, Jack Ryan only failed certification a couple of times, and it was largely on these technical grounds. They were really fast about it. They got back to us usually within a day, and then we would fix stuff by nightfall and kind of send it back. And the whole process took, I think, less than a week, and then we went live. Fortunately, in time for the launch of the show, I'm happy to say. Now we can do dynamic content with our system, so we continue to monitor and tweak things even after launch. But basically, that was it. We have arrived at our destination. Now, you are going to get momentarily an email. I'm going to just remind you to fill out the evaluations for this talk. The recommended excellent rating is highlighted for you. If you ever want to hear me speak again, go ahead and give me that, and we can move on to, I think we got a few minutes for questions. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Are there microphones somewhere? I don't have a way to do that. That would have been cool, but it is out in public and it is free. You can just ask Amazon. It's called Jack Ryan November Morning, and if you just say open Jack Ryan to Alexa, then she'll open it up for you.
I just wanted to thank you again for the talk, but wanted to ask, do you use Alexa, like the voice to text or text to voice? Do you use Alexa's voice sometimes, and what are your design considerations when you're choosing voice acting versus Alexa?
Well, we generally treat Alexa as sort of the host of an experience. So she's always outside the fantasy, just kind of handling a little bit of maybe tutorial stuff, kind of getting you ready, or any kind of help messaging that you want to ask for in the middle of the skill. And then everything else we try and keep in fantasy, which doesn't include Alexa. And even though in this thing, the escape room, the original inspirational material, included Alexa as part of the story, it rapidly became clear that we weren't actually going to be able to do that for various reasons. Some were functional, because we can't from within our skill, access any of Alexa's other abilities, which is the whole reason that she was in those rooms, was to add things for you and stuff like that. So we would have had to recreate all of that. We didn't want to. And the other is that Amazon is understandably a little bit protective about what words you put into Alexa's mouth. And if you make her a character in the story, you got to portray her in a very particular way. And we just didn't want to.
And is there any reason you wouldn't just voice act everything that Alexa had done, like beginning, tutorial, middle parts, right? Well, I guess why would you use her versus everything? 100% voice
as
act?
opposed to having a human sort of be the host. Sometimes we do have a human host, and usually it's me, actually. We have a few things where I come on and give you a few pointers. The tricky bit about that is actually just updating stuff. Like I said, we can update live after we're already out. And if you decide, oh, we need to change this messaging, it's easier to do it with text-to-speech than sending somebody into a studio. Now, if it's me, that's not very expensive. I'll just go and do it for free. It's fine. But if it's anybody else, then it's trouble.
Awesome.
Hi.
Go ahead, Renz. We got another one over here.
Yes. Great talk. Two-part question. Your 50 objects, was that for each chapter or the whole story? And in hindsight, was that too many objects, just enough, or not enough?
Okay. So the 50 objects was for the whole story, and actually, it's not even all objects. About 6 or 8 of those things are people, and you use them in different contexts. There's one of those actions was contact somebody, so you're allowed to kind of call headquarters or try and call your boss or various other people. Yeah, that was actually plenty. That was plenty of stuff to do. Kind of more than an hour worth of material, and that second chapter actually feels very big, even with the amount of stuff. There's probably only about 15 or so things in there. Yeah, it's pretty. That was plenty. I would hesitate to add any more than that.
Your play's done a lot of choicey stuff, and now there's this sort of parsery text adventure. Do y'all feel like, oh yeah, now we've discovered, let's do lots of parsery text adventures from now on? Or do you feel like, oh man, that was a fun experiment. Now we're going to go back and do choicey stuff for the rest of time?
Oh, okay. So he's asking, is this now, having done this, is this going to change our paradigm, and now we're going to do this all the time, or are we going to go back and just do the kind of momentary choice-based stuff? The answer is neither of those is the case. This was, it highlighted some problems for us, but we figured out how to deal with them, and we certainly could do it again, and I think given the right situation, we will. It's a very different feel from some of our other stories, and so those are 2 models that I would use in completely different situations, and I think we will not limit ourselves to those 2 under any circumstances. One of the cool parts of my job is I get to find new ways to use the technology, which is I'm looking forward to doing more weird stuff this year.
Thanks.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, having worked on both visual games and audio games, what you prefer about working in audio?
Ooh, what do I prefer about working in audio over visual? Mostly I like the sort of inexpensive, comparatively, kind of garage operation feel. I like to work small. That lets me experiment more, take more risks, and just generally have more control over things. I can change a lot of stuff up until almost the last minute. We're doing voice recording, but that comes pretty late in the process. I've always liked that from the beginning of some of those earliest graphic adventures that I worked on. One of the reasons I liked them was the art was so simple that we were basically kind of doing puppet theater, and we could just see what we could make out of that without spending too much money trying to draw everything, do match the speech and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Hi, again, thank you for the talk. Oh, sorry.
Yes. Hi, obviously you're a pioneer in this field and you've done a lot of great work. And you've got a lot invested in Earplay. What do you see as the future, what do you see as the marketplace in terms of the growth of the marketplace for these sort of these audio games, and what do you see as sort of the future of this growing? What kind of technology and aspects do you see coming next on the horizon? Marketplace and future.
Ooh. Okay, so that's a pretty broad question, sort of. what do I see in the future in terms of both marketplace and technology? How much time we got? About a minute. Okay, so I think quickly. I think the marketplace is still kind of nascent. There are ways to make money in it. Several of them. Nobody's sort of had a breakout like this company made $1 billion doing X, Y, or Z on it. But I think it's sort of like early days of other platforms, phones, and things like this, where you're seeing people now starting to get into it, and they're starting to have lots of these machines in their houses that just listen to them all the time. So certainly there's market penetration. There's interest in having things to do on the platform, and there's monetization is built into it now. So there's just kind of things need to get shoved over the edge now, where people are comfortable doing that. And I think that's right where we're at now, and I think that'll happen about the next 5 minutes.
Okay, and just Google, the Amazon versus the Google, which one do you prefer using, which platform?
Oh, I try to be agnostic about that.
Okay.
We'd like to publish on both if we can. Usually it's more of a business decision as to, they like exclusivity, the one or the other. But yeah, we can go iOS and Google and Amazon and Bose glasses frames if we want to, and that's my preferred thing.
So that's your future tech then?
Yeah. So we're at an hour. I think we have to go to an overflow room. Am I accurate about that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll be out and across the hall in a second. And thanks very much.